Jordan, really pleased that we're having this conversation. So we're having it about the kind of inciting incident, if you want to call it that, was the piece that you put out with Brandon Hayes. And it's a topic that I've thought about a lot, like what is responsible sense making in this area, but more generally in the kind of decentralized space. And then I've been thinking about that in connection with like the IDW and in connection with a few other things. And then you're doing this interview really kind of brought it to a head in a way for me, kind of thinking about these topics. I know you've written the piece that I've already put together, and the written piece.
Yep, I read it.
Yeah, I guess the first point, I mean, you mentioned in it that a few people have warned you off talking to Brandon. I assume that I'm probably one of them. I guess the first question is, what were you hoping to achieve, not just with the conversation, but also putting it out?
Well, let's see. This is going to be, I think if our conversation goes well, we'll actually delve into some pretty interesting topics, because a lot of these questions need to be taken, actually need to be taken into inquiry. So first order, I wouldn't say that in any obvious sense I had something like a plan or a strategy. I did not come into that with a hoping to achieve. More like almost like a method, maybe a better way of putting it. And the method here was something like, did it feel like the conversation could be had? Did it feel like there was a way to hold the conversation that, hard to explain, wouldn't break? If that makes any sense. So maybe it's worth going into what I mean by that. But that was the first point. And the answer was, actually felt like yes, after some time, by the way. He had a sort of nudging me to engage in conversation for a few months, and it had not felt right. And then there was a period where it suddenly felt yes. And by the way, it felt yes, and quite likely one that should, or at least could be shared. And so when I finished the conversation, I only reflected for a day, because there's a lot of, I guess you might call it energy, before I decided that it did feel like something that was contained enough that sharing it would be useful. And then I did. So what kinds of considerations? Things like, did the tone feel like it was clean enough, i.e. it wouldn't be too confusing or too strong, maybe too intense? Did I feel like I broke with my own integrity is another big question for me. And I did not feel like that was the case. I felt like I was able to hold my integrity through the whole thing, which for me is more important than holding, for example, the sort of precision of my thinking, which is a different issue. Did it feel like there was the stuff that showed up, particularly at the level of the context more than the content, that would be well received by the way, from my perspective, the very few people who actually watch anything that I share? And again, when I contemplated that, the sense was quite likely yes. And then, by the way, the last piece was, did it feel that I noticed that there was something deeper that was actually asking me to share it? And the answer actually was fear. So I actually felt a sense of fear, a felt sense that there was something about sharing this that would potentially be dangerous to me, to my security or my well-being, something pretty primal. And I didn't want to spend too much time trying to make meaning out of it and to narrate that, but just to notice the feeling itself and then try to feel into what's the right way to respond to that feeling. And of course, the learning is to try to step into it, not recklessly. So hopefully it wasn't too reckless, but intentionally. And so, that's a bit of a perspective on it.
And would you say that you're still in an inquiry around the wisdom of it, or the way that it was conducted, or like where are you at with it now? Do you think it was a good decision, and do you have any regrets?
I don't have any regrets. In fact, even just the fact that we're having this conversation, I think is positive evidence. As I said in our Voxers back and forth, I actually felt a bit of a provocation in the way that you were interacting, and I thought that was a good provocation. Which maybe was even part of the event. Remember, these things are not simple, they're complex. And when you pull a string in the web, big pieces of the web begin to vibrate. And maybe that's the point. No, no regret. And of course, one of the things that I take as a method is the past is the past. So trying to go back and sort of retcon my sort of an egoic effort to polish it in a certain way is already a wrong idea. Am I still in inquiry? Of course, very much so. And still ripples are kind of echoing out and coming back. And it's very interesting to see what kind of ripples show up and how they shift things.
Yeah, and I'd like to also get to a point of kind of inquiry, like just being honest about where I'm coming from. I feel a sense of trepidation in this conversation because I know the kind of concerns that I've got, the kind of questions that I'm raising are very easy for me to be seen in a kind of like blue church censoring kind of role in relation to this. And I want to kind of name that. And because I feel that what I'm really trying to wrestle with is in this, we know that the old gatekeeping doesn't work, like this kind of like the blue church strategies of shaming, of kind of saying these topics can be talked about, these can't be. But I feel like we're in a new place where we're all gatekeepers in some way. And I'm wondering, what are our responsibilities in this space? I heard from a lot of people, firstly, when we put out the piece a while ago about your banning from Facebook and Brett's banning from Facebook, that there was this Propertarian story behind the scenes. And then when you put out this other interview, there were all sorts of people in the Game B scene, the integral scene, who were really concerned. And I don't think anyone disagreed or thought that you shouldn't have talked to Brandon, but most, I'd say from my perspective, it was almost universal that the way the interview was done did not give the people watching any idea who Brandon was. And they felt that it was, I guess, the word that came back a few times was irresponsible. The impression I certainly got when I watched it was that you and Brandon were pretty much on the same page on most things, and that you were essentially validating him as an individual within this wider space. You talked about him being committed to the meta crisis. And my feeling from your interview was that the way it was framed did not give the viewers enough background to understand who Brandon was and what he really believed. And that for me is like, that's a set of expectations I have around a conversation with someone who you know is kind of third rail in many ways. Like they've called for civil war. They've been banned from Facebook. Like you knew that you were taking a risk talking to Brandon. Do you think? I mean, the question is like you've read my criticisms and my sort of perspective on it and the way the interview was framed. Do you want to riff off that, or I'm interested in? Sure. Do you think you have any responsibilities, or do we have responsibilities in this space?
Well, of course we have responsibilities, but I think the question is, what's the space? First thing I would throw out is that I noticed a question around the frame of gatekeeper as a frame at all. Which is interesting, right? The notion of traditional gatekeepers are X, whatever we want to call them. And then the notion that in the current context, we are all gatekeepers implies that the function of gatekeeping, or the frame of what that means, translates directly across the portal. My sense is that that's never the case, that nothing of the old translates directly. There's some sort of the deconstruction or disillusion into a more fundamental, basically an essence, transcendent mode, and then a recoherence in the context of the new medium, for example. So the inquiry I would go through is, what's that look like? Like, what is the essence of the virtue of what was good in the context of gatekeeping? And by the way, in the context of things like broadcast media. And then how do we ennoble that in the new context? That's one piece.
Just one question. Is the word gatekeeper and curator synonymous?
No. Very much not. Though there's some similarities for sure.
Because I wonder whether, because we're all
words are not trivial.
Who to speak to, how to do the conversation. Like that's And there will be, I would say, some kind of gatekeeping role involved in that, who you're just in those choices.
So let's drill into that. But for a moment, let me just add the other piece, which I think feels to me like it's pretty important. And it's part of the same story, I think. So in the conversations that I have, one of the things that I try to do, and I notice, in fact, that it's impossible to do completely, but I try to do nonetheless, is to not have a audience-aware frame or approach. Right? So I'm endeavoring to operate in a person-to-person, like we're having a conversation. Right now, the only people who are having this conversation are you and I. And I'm showing up in the way that I would show up if, in fact, we're just you and I, and without any characterization of there being an audience. Because, of course, then there is something performative, right? And that, of course, creates all kinds of weird things about how the ego and the social manipulation training that we all develop that cannot help but show up precisely at the moment where you have the notion of an audience. Think about that as the notion. Audience is an abstract general uncertainty. You have no idea who precisely might be the audience. So therefore, you have to be engaging in activities and communications which have a certain generality to them and a certain, not universality, but an overtonness, right? It implies an implicit overton window, which is to say that which can be legitimately spoken before an audience. Like there's a co-creative context between audience and overton windows in general. And that mode, the mode itself, I would say is a primary problem. It may in fact be that we have to get away from broadcast in general. And that may actually very well be the case. I know that Forrest has been pushing this pretty strongly. But my effort has been to find a way to sort of walk the middle path on that. So have as close to a real peer-to-peer conversation as can be had, and then share it in such a way that other people, if they choose to, can perceive it. So it is not lost, it is not ephemeral, and can take away from it that which they find that they could not find in a performative broadcast audience mode. So now that comes with the cost that, you know, the sorts of techniques that can be produced to generate certain kinds of framing context, which in fact could be responsible framing, aren't available. And this, I think, is part of so if you take these 2 points and you combine them, the idea is that we don't move from here to there. We actually have to move up, over, and down, meaning we abstract from the embodied practices of game A, in this case, Blue Church game A, into a transcendent mode, which is the non-mediated, non-instantiated generator functions. And then from that place, try to relearn how to embody those generator functions in the new context with more clarity and with more, ideally more wholesomeness, which we need a lot these days. So it's an interesting question. Like, how do you actually accomplish the things that you're trying to accomplish in this new medium without the mechanism of trying to simply engage in a sideways? I'll give you a kind of conventional example. Back in the day, when cameras were first happening, most of the early content that happened in both film and television was merely pointing a camera at a teleplay. You took a Broadway, literally a Broadway stage, you pointed a camera at it and you recorded it. And that was it. Because they had no idea what the new medium was and how it operated, what its possibilities and its challenges and its weaknesses were. They tried to slide sideways from their old medium into the new medium. And it produced things for sure. And there were some pretty nice things, but it took almost 2.5 generations to actually learn the nature of the medium in its more fundamental sense. Simple things like being able to play with time, for example, which you can't do if you're just recording something in a linear space, like recognizing that the televised medium has an intrinsically virtualization character with relationship to time. It's a very powerful thing to grasp. So I'm more interested in learning that. And I'm more interested in co-creating it, like discovering it, and trying to figure out what are the values and principles and characteristics that are at the base, that are more fundamental, and then collaboratively learning how that shows up, which of course comes with risk and danger, to be sure, than I am at trying to do something which I've never had any interest in. I'm not a journalist, nor do I care to be, nor do I, by the way, esteem the function. And I don't do interviews, nor do I care to. So it's not my thing. So if you're looking for that and you're coming to the sorts of things that I do, you'll probably be disappointed. And I would
Are you
imagine
searching for truth?
Am I searching for truth? This is a very interesting question. I would say more like seeking. And it's interesting just to notice like the difference in the qualities between those two. It's like the difference between a puzzle and a mystery. A journalist has a puzzle orientation towards truth. There is a truth. There is a set of facts that can be pinned down in a scientific methodology, very Francis Bacon. We'll torture her until she tells us the truth, that kind of a vibe. Whereas this is more the notion of a mystery, the sense that there is a caring and a carefulness that unveils something that is more in the direction of a embodied livingness that is the Petersonian notion of truth, as opposed to the Sam Harris notion of truth, to use a somewhat contemporary reference. So yes, I am seeking the truth, but it's a different kind of thing than I think was the old version that happened in the journalistic scientific mode.
Because I fully agree with where you're coming from in terms of that whole performative aspect of journalism and that sense of exploring. I mean, we've talked about different forms of sense making and dialogos and this kind of sense of progression and the evolution of a conversation within that, which I fully agree with. And I'm trying not to kind of contrast the style of kind of interrogative interviewing, say, of someone like Brandon versus a kind of more exploratory conversation. What I am trying to ask is, even within that form of conversation, was there a way to give the audience more context? Because I feel like the only thing that I can see that interview has achieved is validating Brandon, validating Propertarianism in a way that it was increasingly kind of out of the conversation. Like, I made a decision not to write about them because I kind of felt like they were on their way out. And I think you're someone who, I see myself as a curator. I see I have a lot less authoritative. I'm less of an epistemic authority than I think you are. And there's an interesting question here, because I don't know whether you've necessarily asked for that authority that I think you have. But a lot of people who are watching that interview, when I read the comments, were not aware of who Brandon was. And they've come out with some impression that this guy is speaking the truth, that he's worth talking to, and that he has some ideas related to genetics that aren't entirely clear. And I don't think that most people have got an idea about what they actually believe and who the Propertarians really are. And I think, I don't want to kind of just scare quotes, anti-Semitism, scare quotes, all this stuff. But if you read a lot of what they talk about, it's third rail for a reason. It's dangerous for a reason.
There's an interesting thing that's happening here. So notice, it's not my perspective that I was speaking with the Propertarians. Right? I was speaking with this gentleman who sometimes is called Brandon Hayes. And by the way, sometimes it's called other things. And it's my experience that no human being could ever, even if they wanted to, be nothing more than a particular ideology or organization. And I would imagine if you were to go in and actually have a conversation with, say, 5 or 6 people who spend a lot of time in the domain of Propertarianism and maybe even considered themselves to be Propertarians, you would identify that there were a very, very large number of things over which they had very significant differences and some set of things over which they agreed. And even that's not particularly interesting to me. Like, at the propositional level, the kinds of things that people may or may not present themselves as believing is not the thing I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is, as you said, I'm seeking truth. And to seek truth is to present yourself in a, what does Johnny V call it? Participatory, right? To actually engage. How do I change? What actually changes in me as a consequence of this encounter? And to what degree is something changed in the consequence of the encounter? And if anybody chooses to participate in the encounter, does something change in them? Not what content finds itself landing on the surface of their neocortex, but rather, does anything actually shift or change that is meaningful? And perhaps not, and perhaps so. Good faith is a primary question here. That's an important thing for me. For example, there's another character, what's his name? Brent Cooper, who, by the way, I should say, you and yours oriented positive curation in my direction, i.e., because he was an employee of Perspectiva. And I think also it may have even been related to Rebel Wisdom at some point. I attended to him more than I would otherwise have.
He was never part of Rebel Wisdom.
Never part of Rebel Wisdom, but he was part of Perspectiva, correct?
He wrote a few things for them, yeah.
Yeah, and presented himself as being a meta-modernist, which also has some ambiguous relationship with folks in that universe. My experience of him, after spending some time with him, was that I felt either that, what I would say is that the relationship, this is important for me also, ontologically, that the relationship is more fundamental than the individuals. That the relationship was not able to achieve something like good faith, meaning that there was something going on every time I encountered him where I felt like there was a break, like a lack of continuity. And what that means to me is that I am not yet in a place where I can try to hold a relationship with him where I feel like my own integrity still stays intact. And also I am transforming. Both have to happen. You have to be able to maintain continuity of self. Your own integrity has to stay intact. And you have to participate as deeply as you can in the transformational process. Part of that might be his own personal unwillingness to engage in that. It's hard for me to say. So this is a circumstance where I have not yet felt that having a conversation with him at all, much less a conversation that's shared, is ripe. In Brandon's case, it was much closer to the margin. So in my personal experience, my ability to interact with him in a fashion where my integrity is intact and I learned something, like something changes in me that I feel is a growth and evolution. And I imagine, although of course I do not know for sure, the same thing is happening on his side of the conversation, that there's something about the relationship that has a meaningfulness or a reality to it, is the primary consideration. And I would suggest, by the way, that many of the questions that you are bringing up and that are coming up, if taken from that point of view, have a nutritive effect, Zach Stein's ensoulment. Rather than a developmental question, it's more of an ensoulment question, I think, for everybody who chews on them. The people who find his stuff to be like attractive and easy. All right, well, let's put that to the test. Let's actually fight over that. Most of these people tend to be bellicose, so fighting is their mode of exploration. The people who want to recoil from it, interesting. Well, we're going to have to chew on that too, because this isn't really the kind of thing, this world that we have to build, from my perspective, where kind of the weak link, heterogeneous, weak tribes of the 21st century can't really hang together. We have to find some way of actually being able to achieve an active peace. And sometimes we're going to have to learn how to delve into things that are not pleasant or easy to do it. And we may not be ready for it. But if we feel like we can try, we should try and then see what happens.
And because I mean, one of the questions is, what does an immune system in this space begin to look like?
Mm-hmm.
Because I would have
It's
said,
a real question.
Like for me, I've encountered Brandon quite a bit in various Facebook groups. I've been in contact with various people who've engaged him a lot more deeply than I have. And the general consensus among people I trust is that there is a level of non-reciprocity. There is a level of parasiting certain groups. And I don't get, when I look at Brandon in the interview you did with him, I don't get a sense that this is someone who is embodied, exploring and moving towards a good faith interaction around the questions.
Well, obviously I'm undecided on that. I'm not sure that I agree with that consensus. One of the things that I noticed in that context is that there's another person, Leo Deforge. And if I look at the artifacts that are produced by people who are part of that consensus, they paint him with the same brush. But I've actually had an opportunity to spend more time with him because he was actually a moderator of the Game B community. Jim asked him to do that. And so I actually engaged with him somewhat meaningfully from a position of being a moderator. And then when I left the Game B community, our relationship didn't go completely away. We continued to have conversations, although not a lot. I don't talk a lot with many people. And I would say with a very high degree of confidence that he is not a bad guy. He's a good faith operator. At least I would be willing to stake my own reputation on that, which I just did, in case you want to share this. And so, therefore, I have an interesting challenge that if I see a brush that includes him in a set, and the intent is that that set is bad guy set, then I have to question the integrity and or the competence of that setting, what is actually doing that work. So I can't use it to curate effectively my own relationships, which then means I have to actually go dig deeper myself. So there you are. And it's weird. It's actually anti-signal. Like on my own, I might have actually not had any particular calling to engage with Brandon. But when I noticed that there was a process that was, from my perspective, engaging in providing bad signal around Leo, and then also happened to be capturing a sort of a thing that was moving through the space, I noticed this character over here that maybe was actually closer to the thing the process was actually appropriately affecting, which, you got to find boundaries. If you want to learn about things, you find out what their edges are, and then you see where those edges are strong and where they're weak. So therefore, to go deeper with him is actually necessary to get a better sense of what's up. The other piece is to say, if you think about the threat condition, let's say the threat condition that is presented by this particular group, which he very much says he's a part of. So I'm not denying by any means that he intentionally, he has an intent to further the thing, this group. I just wonder how much he actually is, or what that even would mean. It's not clear to me that it's actually even a thing, to be honest. We're entering into very quickly, like not long, entering into a world where things like, let's say, CRISPR are rapidly going to become easy to access. What I mean by that is smaller and smaller groups with less and less capacity will be able to deliver highly asymmetric harm to the commons, to the world, to humanity. And unfortunately, COVID demonstrated precisely how incompetent we are at dealing with it, which is, at the end of the day, quite a trivial perturbation. So if there are, in fact, actually concentrated groups of bad guys out there, we're not going to be able to whack-a-mole them into non-existence. That's a blue church, vanity. The war on terror modality that made so much hay in the first half of the century not only can't possibly work in the future, but actually has contra effects. It produces its own, it evolves the thing that will actually wrap around it. And we're not talking about car bombs and the occasional gun attack. We're talking about the possibility of actually wiping out big chunks of the species or precipitating something that is catastrophic, i.e. a spiral effect where the escalation begins out of control. This, by the way, I think is a bit of the opportunity that may have been missed in Jamie's book when he talks about rapture ideologies. So we best engage with them now while we're relatively safe and try to find out what process might be able to be put in place that can take individuals who may actually be intrinsically moved into places of relative risk, like actually willing to talk about violence, like much more interesting than somebody who's so cowed by a civilization that they can't actually muster the energy to fight for something. The people who are actually willing to openly talk about violence simultaneously are potentially the most dangerous, but also potentially the most useful to engage with, because there are many people who are willing to engage in violence who aren't going to talk about it. So what do we do? How do we actually learn how to achieve active peace? It's a real challenge. It's not going to be had by avoiding conversations or blocking people online. A much deeper notion of seeking truth, for example.
Sure. And I don't think, I'm certainly not suggesting that the conversation should be avoided. I mean, my primary point is mostly about the context for the conversation, is whether the viewer is getting enough information to make up their mind. I mean, this is something that I've kind of been thinking about for quite a while. I kind of criticized, it was the main reason that I criticized Dave Rubin, for example, was not like a lot of people were like, oh, Dave Rubin gets on these controversial people. And it's like, it's not the issue. And that's a low resolution complaint that he just talks to controversial people. It's like this whole guilt by association thing. That's a kind of old school way of contaminating the conversation. It's more that if you're going to get controversial people on, I think it is part of the responsibility to sense making to explain why they're controversial. And I know that you're in I understand the dilemma that you're expressing, because it starts to become a sort of much more formal interview. If you've got a set of questions, it's like, well, I need to ask him about this. I need to ask him about this. I need to ask him about this. But I do think that a certain amount of that framing is necessary to give for the audience to understand who this person is. Again,
you're framing as an audience. And if you're doing journalism with an audience, then you're probably right.
But aren't you? I mean, it's one thing to have the conversation, but you're choosing to put the conversation out. So you're then engaging an audience. You're then in an audience dynamic, whether you want to be or not. Are you not?
I'm sharing my conversation, and people can choose whether they want to engage with it. It's not the same thing. I don't have any desire, for example, to grow an audience. Think about how important that is. One of the challenges that Rubin has, like any rock star, a rock star who creates their first album out of their soul, then has a real problem. They now have an audience. The audience wants the image that they were attracted to, not the essence of the soul of the rock star. So now they have the sophomore slump, where they try to simulate the thing that was effective so they can grow and maintain the audience, right? This social relationship, this abstraction with a population that you don't actually know. This is the challenge that somebody like Dave Rubin has fundamentally. He found himself in this awkward situation, like Eric Weinstein has as well, where he has an audience. He has a whole bunch of people who are interested in the persona and the felt sense of the kind of things that they were able to plug into by having this transgressive relationship where suddenly they could actually interact with controversial figures. But once you've got an audience, then your ego is attached to the audience. Right? I have no interest in that at all. Like, perhaps one of the virtues of this particular conversation is that those who relate to me in the orientation towards audience will simply move along. They'll have no interest in me. It's an interesting character that I heard about recently. I wish I could remember his name right now. Philosopher of science. The hell is his name? Zach was talking to me about him. Apparently a truly brilliant individual. But he went through 3 different fundamental phases. You might actually have heard of him because his second phase engaged with the integral community. So his first phase was fundamentally philosophy of science, like deep, deep, deep philosophy of science. Maybe his third phase. Yeah. His second phase was Marxism. He shifted and became interact with the Marxist community and engaged in all the kinds of critiques and things that happened there. And again, at a genius level. But that movement deeply alienated almost everyone who was part of his first audience. Right? They didn't want that. They wanted the thing that they were attracted to. They wanted the image of that persona. And when his soul moved to this new place, they didn't come with him. Some did, but almost nobody did. Then he made another move. From the Marxist domain, he moved to this other domain that was in the direction of sort of like spirituality. And I think he specifically integrated with the integral scene and with Ken Wilber. And again, you can imagine a bunch of atheist Marxists, how turned off they'd be by that move. And so like the volcano under the Hawaiian Islands, he sort of kept moving in the direction that his soul took him without at least meaningful consideration for the consequences for the audience, and perhaps even a positive consideration that those relationships are not real and not strong, and you can't build anything useful out of them. So audience, no, not interested. To the degree which somebody is showing up to me in an audience mode, I prefer they not. And I would urge them to learn never to do that, actually. Audience is a bad mode. It's a bad role to take. Collaborator, co-creator, challenger, sure. That's the kind of thing we're trying to build. It's a real shift. It's a hard shift, particularly if you've been trained that way. So this question of what is this new thing that used to be the thing that gave rise to Gatekeeper? Notice I had to do 2 moves, right? There was a thing that had a vital essence to it. that eventually showed up as gatekeeper, and probably many other things. Curator is probably a subset or a sub species of the same higher order thing. Many of which became corrupt, of course, and became exploited and gamed and whatnot, as they tend to. The inquiry of, okay, what is this new thing? How do we go back up into the most vital center and then come back down? Can't be gatekeeping. That implies things like gates. And of course, gates are around territories. And territories tend to be civilization, cities, castles, protected things. But boundaries, different idea. Right? A boundary is a different idea than a gate. A gate has a strong enclosure that has only one specific opening, very narrow, very well guarded. And then there's some very simple process that allows things to come and go. Right? A cell membrane is very different. Maybe that's a better metaphor. What does it mean to actually build a boundary, a membrane that has the ability to selectively bring in the resources that are necessary and appropriate for the vital health of the interior while keeping the toxic components out and recognizing that we are no longer individuals?
Within that context of like a cell wall or some other boundary, what do you think are there non-negotiable qualities that someone would need to show up with to be like, what are we screening out with that boundary, I guess?
What's the toxin? So it's interesting because it has to do with the notion of the relationship as being more fundamental. So there is, in fact, nothing that's non-negotiable in the abstract, because we're not dealing with abstract relationships between individuals. We're dealing with real relationships where the relationship is always going to be now a kind of an admixture, a bit of an alchemy. So the question is actually going to be more like, what's going to be non-negotiable is circumstances where the encounter can't, in fact, achieve integrity in relationship. Now, this is going to involve everybody involved in the relationship. And so, for example, I do not have the capacity to come into real relationship, meaningful relationship, integrous relationship with Brent, as far as I can tell so far. Part of that is me, part of that is him, part of that is things beyond both of us, right? It's the whole complex, the whole warm data milieu. I may be able to come into something like an integrous relationship with aspects of Brandon, right? Aspects of me can come into integrous relationship with aspects of him. And for the moment, it forms a new being, which is those aspects coming into relationship and exchanging perspectives and possibilities and tensions. And then perhaps coming back into relationship with the complex relationality that is me, right? Aspects of me in relationship with each other, hoping to achieve integrity. Right? So this question of integrity is key. If I cannot maintain my own integrity, that's non-negotiable. If I cannot enter into a new relationship that can achieve some level of integrity, even if it's minuscule, it can be tiny. It doesn't have to be much, but it can't achieve that or wants to do more than it can hold, right? Those are two sides of the same coin. Then that's a non-starter. That can't work. Wants to move faster than it can move or take on more than it can take, right? Being able to start where it can start and builds in from the interior out, from the smallest, and say, okay, are we still holding? Are we still holding? Are we still holding? And if it breaks, what happens then? If it breaks, is there a predatory move that actually begins to break the integrity here? Dangerous, not good. If it breaks, is there an unconsciousness that tries to grab more here and do stuff here? Also not good. And by the way, the arrow goes that way too. Does it parasitize or predate the integrity over here? I would say something like that, like something that actually has the capacity to disseminate a viral degradation of individual and collective integrity would be something to be very, very like super careful of. Like keep it in tight containers. I'm reminded here of Tyson Yunkaporta's point that in the indigenous metacultural code, the spirit that shows up as narcissism in the North America, Waitiko is a name for it. That's it. You got to look out for the devil. Keep your eye out for Ahriman, right? Think about the egregore of Moloch. Like that's the thing we have to be keeping our eyes out for and noticing where that is actually grasping and holding yourself and or the other and or the relationship. And do you have the capacity to be in relationship with something that is able to hold the integrity of that in a different place so that the devil cannot determine what happens in the relationship?
There's another point that you mentioned, Leo Desforges, before, who's someone I've interacted with and was actually in the film that we did about Facebook kicking a few people off. And someone I had interactions with and agree, I get a very different somatic experience of interacting with him than I do from watching Brandon. Like I'm
very different dudes
as well in like, what role does somatics play in sense making? Because for me, it's like, and I guess an open question is, what sense did you get in your body when you were interacting with Brandon? Because for me, I got a very strong, not pleasant sensation.
Well, I'm not afraid of him as a person. Sort of fundamental level, I'm not afraid of him or even what he represents. If it turns out that, for example, there is an intent on their part to foster some sort of violent conflict, and it comes down to my having to kill him, that's just what happens. Right? So my body isn't concerned with that. For people's bodies who do have that kind of a concern, I can imagine it might be very challenging.
Well, I don't think it was fear. I mean, to be honest, I find them.
I have no idea what's going on in your body. The question is about mine.
But I don't think my bodily sense and a few other people. There were 4 people who contacted me, all of whom had only interacted with Brandon online, and so this was the first time that they'd seen him in person.
Mm-hmm.
They all remarked on how different he was in text to in person, and that they felt that he was very disconnected. He was very. They felt very uneasy watching him, and like I'm just saying, it's not fear for me. I actually I look at what happened to the Propertarians, and for me, they're kind of they were LARPing as these kind of bad guys, and in a way they kind of weren't. So I don't think it was fear. I think it was something else.
Yeah, I don't think they were necessarily LARPing as bad guys, although there was meaningful vice signaling, virtue signaling and vice signaling, meaningful vice signaling. But the word LARPing lands quite well for me as well. I would say they were LARPing as competent as a first and foremost. And I've issued that critique specifically. So look, man, if you're going to play with these guys, you might want to find new playmates, because my concern is actually more about their competence than anything else. Like even at the level of tactics. But yes, I agree. There's something something there in terms of not disconnected. Well, yes, disconnected, but disconnectedness in a very particular way. Like if you're in an interaction or a conversation with somebody who's in the rationalist community, the disconnectedness is a little bit easier to identify and to name, at least for me, because my disconnectedness came with that character. So it's a little bit easier for me to be like, oh yeah, I remember that. His is different. And by the way, let me just quickly jump out to a big frame. As far as I can tell, with maybe minuscule exceptions, we're all suffering from a 50,000 year catastrophe, which has dragged our souls across the pavement of civilization. I've not met anyone who isn't disconnected in truly meaningful ways. So the inquiry is something like, okay, where is the lack of wholesomeness? Where precisely can we find it? What does that show up as? Can I feel it in myself? Like obviously if something in you is uneasy, then either you're feeling something in yourself that is like, oh, and I don't want to go there, or it's, oh, there's a threat, right? That's pretty much it. That's the only way it can be uneasy. There's either a threat or there's a threat. There's a threat from the outside or a threat from the inside. That's what uneasiness means. And I don't feel particularly uneasy when I'm interacting with him. I have concern with the pace. Like it feels to me like he wants to go too fast. He wants to move to certain things too quickly. Concern with the certainty, for sure. There's a sense that there's a settled of like to say something forcefully is the same thing as to in fact accurately convey reality helpfully and usefully. At the same time, I'd say that we're not talking about somebody who is not worth engaging with from my perspective. There's actually some very interesting insights in the land that he's walked and the path that he's trod, that if you actually have the capacity to hold your own integrity in relationship, you can learn. I've learned. I was talking with a woman the other day, whose name I won't give because, as we've mentioned, these paintbrushes are unfortunate, who actually said, wow, I learned a lot in that conversation. This is not a trivial person. So let's see, what's in there? Well, I mean, one, of course, is anger. Anger. He's an angry man. Very fucking angry. Super angry. Like insanely angry. As angry as people ought to be. As angry as I am. He is absolutely livid and unwilling to kill himself, I think is a key thing here. Think about that. Right? We're in a situation where the reality is, really for most people, you're either going to kill yourself or you're going to fight. And we're not in a situation where simply not doing has any future to it. And if you go along with the civilization structures that we've inherited, you're imbibing toxicity through every pore. Your soul will be strip mined to nothingness, and everything that you love and care for will be decimated. Right? That's what's up. That's what we're facing. That's what we're in. Every food you eat will be some sort of horrible monstrosity of toxicity and genetic manipulation. Every medium that you absorb will be hyper manipulative and super salient. Right? That's what the kind of passive base case is. And you know it, everybody knows it. There's no way to avoid it. Your body feels it. But what do? You shut yourself down. Put your head down. You slump your shoulders. Take a look at Gen Z. Look at their bodies. They're all like this. They're all slumped like this. Their shoulders are in. Their backs are curved. There's a felt sense of being slowly destroyed. Not the acute destruction of the swift blow, but the chronic destruction that chews away at your interior and, by the way, your physicality. But nobody wants to be the one that steps out. Nobody wants to be the one who stops shocking themselves for 8 hours a day. So everybody sort of slowly fights themselves and squishes themselves and forces themselves back into what is surely extinction or extinguishing of meaningfulness. Some people's anger is so strong that they fight. My critique of them is not the energy, not the anger. It's the tactics. It's the strategy. It's the depth. If they can't hold that anger in service to a higher, deeper love, then they're not going to get good results either. Right? Either direction is death. The challenge is, can you actually find a way to bring that anger into service to what it wants to serve with enough skillfulness to actually achieve the liberation of the soul that you yearn for? Not easy, right? But when I see that energy, I find myself, is there a way to bring this energy through the travails of the catastrophes that all of us have been subject to into a place where it can actually make effective choices? Can it become an ethical anger? Can it actually shift from something that burns to something that powers? So that's what I sense, I think, something like that.
And I mean, for me, the key ingredient is whether someone is coming in with their own inflexible frame of certainty about what the nature of the situation is, what the nature of the crisis is. And if they are, then that kind of level of anger is not necessarily helpful.
No, it's quite the opposite. If they are, in fact, the word inflexible is crucial. Right? So there's obviously going to be relative flexibility. But
obviously, I'm referring to Brandon here because that's my impression of him from everything I've seen.
Yeah, Brandon is also very angry and also very inflexible, at least from the point of view of what I can do. Right? There's maybe other people who can interact with him in a fashion which is healthy. I don't know. But from my perspective, there's a deep level of righteousness and inflexibility. Like actually holding the frame is more important than actually achieving truth in the deeper sense. You know, holding rightness in the Sam Harris sense is more important than holding capital T truth in the Petersonian sense. And I'm saying that now, noticing that Brandon despises Peterson. So that's actually an interesting thing to think about. Yes, well, this is a real trouble. You know, self-righteousness in that sense, like the egoic need to be right, instead of actually being able to undergo the transformation that needs to be undergone in the service of something that is more meaningful, is a primary challenge, like pretty close to the center as far as I can tell.
I guess
and that might be found, by the way, in the case of this character, Brandon. I haven't found it myself. I've actually pushed him in certain places. Now, of course, he may be prevaricating. He may just be lying. As you say, if he's acting in bad faith, he has some subsidiary agenda and will shift and flow and modulate to maintain something. I don't know what exactly. And it will appear that he is thinking. It'll appear that he is transforming, that he's actually with me in the crucible. But he's not. That would be a very bad thing, a very dangerous character indeed. I have not yet come to the point where I can say with confidence that that is the case. In fact, so far, much the opposite. As I've watched him over the past 4 years, not a lot of interactions, but I actually have seen him. He showed up on my Facebook page maybe even longer ago. There has been an evolution, and that evolution is in a direction that I would consider to be a positive, not a negative. more valorous, more noble, more precise, and also more flexible. I noticed that, as I've said, those who identify themselves or connect with that thing, the ideology, bizarrely enough, Propertarian, right? It puts an ism at the end, which already tells you there's a mess, tend to have an inflexibility. I tend to have a real strong anchoring on what I consider to be a relatively narrow band of insight. There's insight there, but they're like, that's the thing. Like, now we have it. Let's go. And yet, I have to say, I've been very intrigued by the fact that many of the terms, like you said, reciprocity, right? And the concern or the critique is the lack of reciprocity, in spite of the articulation of reciprocity as being value deep, right? It is their explicit ethos that reciprocity may be one of the deepest values. And I hear this when I talk to various groups of people whose wisdom I consider to be quite deep, particularly indigenous. The reciprocity is very close to like the basic, most fundamental code. So violation of the values that you explicitly articulate is a pretty good sign that you are not on the right path. And I think for those who have a more journalistic, well, what am I saying, even prosecutorial? What's the right term here? There's some term, something that can be discovered. Prosecution is not bad, and I don't mean that in a negative sense at all. Intent, perhaps they can ferret that out as opposed to engage in sort of interpretation and interpolation. That has the negative characteristic of capturing people like Leo who shouldn't be in that net. Catch the aspects of self, the characteristics, and to the degree to which there are people who are so bound up with their aspects that shouldn't be let through the boundary, then of course they themselves have to stay on the other side of the boundary until further notice. That would be a very valuable thing to have, for sure.
I mean, there's another interesting.
By the way, I think we maybe have run out of time. I've got a call more or less now, so let's wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'd wrap it up by saying that we're all making kind of relatively snap judgments in a way, like we're navigating by instinct as well as kind of research and all of these other things. For me, like propertarianism, to me, like that whole memeplex feels like a kind of weaponized autism or weaponized kind of Asperger's. It's got a very kind of hyper Asperger type. And I think the problem is the feminine. Like there's a kind of dislike of complexity, a kind of dislike of kind of the messiness of the world that they think you can kind of think yourself out of.
I share that sense. The notion that the wrong relationship with the feminine, like a perspective on the feminine that is a reductive perspective, and also a lack of a actual relationship with the feminine, like really deeply embodying it and imbibing it, feels to me very lacking, and may in fact be the center of what is lacking. Maybe.
Right. Thank you for coming into this inquiry together, Jordan.
You're welcome. Thank you for provoking me into it. I hope you have a good day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.